Hello everyone, welcome to this event at the Bookworm, which is co-sponsored with the Royal Asiatic Society. And I just want to personally thank Victoria for choosing this subject to research it, because it's a very big part of ex-Soviet Union, and I don't think we really learn it in school that much. But I also want to say that here at the Bookworm we prepared the list of the literature you might be interested in after listening to Victoria, so please be free, come and order those books. We didn't have time to get them in, but they're all available, and they'll be here like in 2 weeks if you will be really interested. And now I want to introduce Alan Babington-Smith. He's the president of Royal Asiatic Society, and he'll say a couple words.
Thank you. Julia, the couple of words I'm going to say are thank you to you. It is splendid that Victoria has agreed to come and talk to us about and tell us the results of her research over many years into what is largely her personal family history. And we're very lucky to have as a moderator Callum MacLeod, who was the author of basically the best guidebook to Uzbekistan, written now some 15 years ago.
Well, at the time, the only guidebook.
Without more, I'll hand it over to you, Callum, to take it further.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. But above all, thanks to Victoria Kim for what she's about to tell us about. She's a multimedia writer and producer from Uzbekistan, been based in Beijing for 4 years now. Is that right? Okay. She'll talk for about 1 hour with only a few, hopefully non-Trump-like interruptions from me, and then about half an hour for Q&A from all of yourselves, so get thinking with some good questions. I think we should start with a hands up. Who's been to Uzbekistan? Excellent. That's sort of that's over a half. Well, I'm sure tonight's talk will inspire the rest of you to join her, to go and the rest of you to go and visit. And of course, if you do visit, as Alan said, you might pick up the and if not a guidebook like that, some nice pattern things like this, incredible souvenirs, etc. that you can pick up in Uzbekistan. In my book, you can learn some fun facts like Uzbekistan is one of only 2 doubly landlocked countries in the world, and we'll have an answer to that one at the end. What you won't learn about is the extraordinary story that Victoria has revealed and continues to document. Rather selfishly, I've long been grateful personally for the Korean presence in Uzbekistan. Now, for those of you who've been there, I mean, you'll, at least in terms of eating, you're well aware that in Uzbekistan every year is the year of the sheep. Mutton fat used in very well in shashlik kebabs, in plov, the pilau rice. But when you're, for example, researching a guidebook for months on end, and we've done 8 editions now, you want to have a break from that sometimes. And in every bazaar, you could find delicious kuksi, the cold noodles, and these are made by descendants of the Koreans we're going to hear about tonight. But they remained a mystery, and I knew they'd been banished there from far away, but never managed to find out much more about them, as I imagine most of you. So with that, over to you, Victoria. Thank you.
Let me move closer to the microphone. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and so many people and talking for an hour. I feel quite nervous. So thank you all, and I'm also quite surprised to see how many of you have been to Uzbekistan, to Central Asia. I'm originally from Tashkent, Uzbekistan myself, and I've been living abroad for the last 11 years and 4 years here in China, but I regularly come back home, of course. And I actually want to start with a question to those of you who have been to Uzbekistan or other stands. What struck you most when you went there for the first time? Anyone? I'm hoping for the right answer here, but of course all answers are right answers, so anyone? No? Okay. Yeah?
The ruins of the great culture.
Architecture. Yeah. And you know, one other amazing thing that people notice, especially outsiders, especially tourists and everyone who comes to Uzbekistan, my home country, in our region, Central Asia, is how ethnically mixed we are. You know, in Uzbekistan, besides Uzbeks, who are the ethnic majority, of course, we have Russians, we have Tatars, we have Koreans, and it's amazing to see so many Koreans. Like, we have a lot of Koreans, especially in and around Tashkent. And they are locals, they are as Uzbekistani as all of us, including myself. But usually this is what surprises, this is one of those things that surprises foreign guests and visitors the most. And from the beginning, like, if you think about it, we don't have any apparent connection with the Korean Peninsula. As Kolom has rightly mentioned, we're a double landlocked country, and we're geographically quite relatively far away from Korea, so it's very difficult to explain in a few words or like in a sentence or tell it very simply how did Koreans end up in Uzbekistan. It's actually quite a complicated story. It has a long and very complicated history. And for me, it has also a personal, very big personal history and personal reason behind trying to do this research and endeavoring into this project, Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story, which is the multimedia long read that I published at the end of last year. And this year, over the summer, it was run by the diplomat. I'll show you here in 3 parts, so you can read it online on its own webpage or on the diplomat's website. Just type in the name, Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story. So today we'll talk about the history and about the realities of the past and present as well for those Koreans in Uzbekistan. And this will be based on my multimedia long read and additional research and features I publish on the topic. And I also try to walk you through some photography I prepared from personal archives and some historical archives on Soviet Koreans. And I will try also to show you some videos, so I hope I will be able to manage talking and showing everything at the same time, so please bear with me. I'll throw at you some Korean faces to start with, as everyone can see, right?
Can we get the lights down maybe a little?
So these are Korean young people, local Tashkent residents on the streets of Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. They are not foreigners, they are local residents, and this is a Korean girl with an Uzbek boy, a girlfriend and boyfriend. And usually when the foreigners come from the Asian countries, Asian guests, like from China, Korea, and other countries, local people often mistake them with our local Koreans, and they try to speak to them in Russian. And for foreign visitors, are always very surprised, like, why do you think we're locals? Well, because we have our own Koreans. And also these stanzas, Colin was rightly mentioning about kuksi and Korean salads. This is something very typical for us throughout Central Asia. On every Central Asian market across Uzbekistan, on every market, you will find the stalls full of Korean food, and these Korean ladies usually selling them. And this is also part of our national cuisine. This is like not foreign food, and this is like our normal food we eat also on a daily basis. Even when I was a child studying at school in Uzbekistan, usually between the classes we were taking the break and going to the market and eating Uzbek hot dog. What is Uzbek hot dog? It's half of Uzbek bread naan, which is round, filled with these Korean salads. This is what we call Uzbek hot dog, and it's like all children at school eat it. And these Korean salads, they're very particular because they're quite different from the South Korean cuisine, as many of you probably know, especially those connoisseurs of Korean cuisine and South Korean cuisine, they're much closer to the North Korean cuisine actually. And these are like typical North Korean style pancang or salads. And these Koreans also, which we have in Uzbekistan, they're also ethnically from the north. So we'll talk about it in a more detail, of course. And so besides this Korean community and Korean food, we also have Korean cemeteries where like only Koreans are buried. There are a lot of them, especially outside Tashkent and in other provinces in Uzbekistan. And Koreans go to the cemeteries every year during all traditional Korean festivities, which all Korean and other Northeast Asian nations share, like the Tomb Sweeping Day and the Moon Festival, and in Korean called Chuseok and Hansik, so in autumn and in spring. And it's very peculiar. I'll show you also later a video. Hopefully, if I forget, Colin, please remind me where we'll see some of those rituals. So the question, how come all these Koreans ended up in Uzbekistan, for me has always been a very personal question, because I'm actually a quarter Korean myself, and I have a Korean last name, Kim, as some of you may have noticed. And the reason for me to actually to start this research and to start this multimedia project and everything that followed is my Korean grandfather. He raised me. I was raised by a single mom and her parents, so we had a very small family, and he was like a father for me, so this fatherly figure. And since my early childhood, I was actually always very, very intrigued by his Koreanness. Here you can see on the picture him and my Russian grandmother and my mom, half Korean child, half Korean, half Russian child. So he was quite different from the rest of us, and like we had this small but predominantly kind of culturally Russian family dominated by my very strong-willed Russian grandma, and I had this Korean grandpa who looked different, who ate like Korean food, he loved Korean food, and we had these Korean people around. So one day, I remember when I was still a small child, I asked him, "Grandpa, how come you are like my grandfather and you're Korean, and like how did you come to Uzbekistan? Like, were you born here? What's up with all of these Koreans in Uzbekistan?" And he told me very like casually, "No, I wasn't born here. I was brought here on a train." And that was a very mysterious story for my like childish mind. I said, like, "How come you were brought here on a train? Did you come alone?" And he told, "No, we all were brought here on the trains to Uzbekistan. They brought us here." And he never really told me anything beyond that. And I don't remember why we kind of didn't continue that conversation. He changed the subject, I guess. But that story, this story actually stuck to my mind. And only later, much later, I learned actually that the journey on the train was the deportation, and that all Koreans, they were actually brought to Central Asia and to Uzbekistan, my home country, as a result of a very big ethnic deportation, which was also the first massive deportation of an entire nationality in the Soviet Union. So of course we'll talk about it in more detail a little bit later. I'll just very quickly walk you through the pictures here. Here you see my mom, half Russian, half Korean, and she's in the kindergarten here. And also in Tashkent, she was born in 1956, so this is like late 60s, I guess. And you can see also all the children, they're like Russian, Eastern European, so we had like a huge mix. And she was the only Asian child. And my grandma always were telling those stories about her, that in the kindergarten, like she always stood up. And this is my grandfather, and my mom, and my granny, and her sister, my grandmother's sister, my grandfather's sister. So this is like very idyllic pictures from that epoch, from those times, which also kind of show a little bit that feeling of brotherhood of nations we had in the Soviet Union and in Tashkent and Uzbekistan, where a lot of people ended up of different nationalities, of different ethnicities. Many of them in the result of forced deportation, some of them voluntarily, and other movements of people, which we also talk a little bit more later on. And this is my Korean relatives, my grandfather's mother with her children and grandchildren, so this would be like my mom's cousins, And also having this Korean family and these relatives which were so different, and like all of them were Korean, they lived on the Korean collective farm, always since childhood intrigued me quite a lot. So I'll tell you a little bit more about my grandfather before really going deep in the story of the deportation. He passed away in 2007, and I was studying at the US back then. I just finished my master's degree, and I was on that year when they give you the OPT training permission to stay in the country while you're looking for the job, but you cannot really leave because you will lose your visa status. And that same year, my grandfather died. And I actually, because of the visa issues, I couldn't go back to my home country to see him. And I never actually said goodbye to my grandfather. And he raised me, and he was someone very important for me. So losing him was like, and especially not being able to go back then, and to say goodbye, and was a very dramatic, very tragic thing personally. But what struck me the most back then was losing his Koreanness. This was maybe even a bigger loss, because he was the only Korean in my family, and also he was the one who held that story about the deportation, which we actually never had a chance to talk about in more detail ever since the talk we had when I was a child. So losing him and losing his story was so dramatic on a personal level, but it also made me realize that all of those people, all of that generation that came to Uzbekistan as the original deportees, also they were dying, because he was more or less at the same age. In the same age group, he was brought to Uzbekistan as a 7-year-old child, so they were like the youngest ones, and they were dying. And so we were losing those stories, we were losing that history, and it was, I think, something very tragic, because even among ourselves in my home country, in our region, in the former Soviet Union, as Yulia has very rightly mentioned, we didn't know that history, and we didn't talk about that history much, because this was something we could not discuss for a very, very long time. And this is why also it stayed so that people still don't talk about it, or are afraid to talk about it. So this was the major reason that I finally undertook this project. Eventually, I always kept it in the back of my mind that I have to, this is my debt, a personal debt, before my grandfather, who had passed away already, so I have to apologize, to say goodbye properly, and do this project as an homage to him and to all of those Koreans who came to Uzbekistan on those trains. So actually, afterwards, of course, luckily I found a job, and then eventually I was able to go back regularly, and one day I went and undertook the purpose of actually looking for those stories and finding those Koreans who would tell me those stories. And we will also talk about that a little bit later in more detail. But I wanted actually, I don't know if it's a good moment to switch to the history of everything.
Perhaps if you explain briefly, I mean, why did this incredible deportation happen? I mean, we can see from the map there, it went to several countries, but I think predominantly Uzbekistan. But what was the main reason behind it? We're talking 1937 now.
Yeah. So basically, as you can see from this map, this was not the only deportation. Like all of these arrows are movements of people, and most of them are forced movements of people. And the movement of Koreans was from the Far East. That's the longest map, longest arrow on the map. You'll probably will be able to see it. It's the deportation which occurred from the Far East when the Koreans were brought to Central Asia in 1937. But besides that, they were also moving people not only from the eastern borders, but also from the western borders. And those deportations, they started even early in the 1930s. But I think I will start with the very beginning. We'll come back to this, of course, also chronologically, when we will be in the 1930s. But I want to start with the very beginning, because when usually I was trying to explain this story, and even in the process of making this documentary, I was trying to explain about the fact that Koreans were brought to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, from the Russian Far East. Everyone was asking me, but like, where were they brought from, you say, to Uzbekistan, from the north of Russia, from North Korea? How come they ended up in the Far East? And actually, I think that's the good also moment to start the whole historical background behind the forced movement of Koreans to Central Asia. So these are, and why actually are we talking about the whole ethnicity? Because we know also that the majority of Koreans has been living on the Korean peninsula. But these are Soviet Koreans, so this was a very special group, and they all lived in the Primorsky Krai. And Primorsky Krai you see here on the map. This is the map of modern-day Russia. So this area in red is Primorsky Krai. So this is the tip of Russian territory, former Soviet Union territory, which borders China and the very tip of present-day North Korea. So it borders mainly China, and then there is this tip of North Korea, which is the present-day Hamgyong province, the very north. And now you can see better that that very northern tip of North Korea, on the upper right corner, I would say, and where you see the Vladivostok city. So that tiny territory is the Primorsky Krai, where all of the Soviet Koreans lived before 1937, and these were almost 200,000 people. So how did they move? They effectively moved to Russia first, and what later became Soviet Union. They moved there from North Korea. Back then it was still unified Korea. And back then it was Hamgyong province in the north of the unified Korea, separated from the territory by the Tumen River, or Tumangan in Korean and other languages. So that territory became part of Russia, like you see here, Inner Manchuria and Outer Manchuria. So Inner Manchuria in more reddish color, and Outer Manchuria on the right, which is Russian territory now in the pinkish, more pinkish color. So this territory became Russian territory in 1860 after Russia and China had signed the Treaty of Beijing, or Peking, the Treaty of Peking. There were two treaties of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Peking in 1860. And after these treaties, that whole area of Outer Manchuria became Russian. And this is when they found the first Korean settlers on that very tiniest tip of Primorsky Krai near Vladivostok. So Koreans had been moving to the territory, which used to be the Chinese Qing dynasty's territory, even before that. But the first 13 families were found on the territory in the 1863, after the territory became Russian. And since then, actually, Koreans started moving there massively. It happened so for several reasons. First of all, the territory, newly acquired territory, was practically uninhabited. It had no people, so Russian government gave very favorable conditions to anyone who would move there. They were giving a lot of land. They were giving I think 100 or 200 even of desatines of land per family, and they were also at the beginning giving Russian citizenship and the right to be covered by the Russian laws to all of immigrants. And in Korea back then, the situation was very, very bad in the feudal Korea back then, because in that northern area where geographically it's very unfavorable for agricultural purposes. It's very cold also. Korean peasants suffered a lot, and they were very heavily taxed, and also I think there was obligatory military service and things like that. So they actually were looking for ways to escape from there. And also it happened so that back then there was a huge flood. There was a flooding of the Tumen River in 1869, and actually it's very interesting because I think last week there was also a huge flooding of the same river, Tumen River, which was really very bad for North Korea. It was really very, very, how to say, devastating flooding, and they were even comparing it, I think. Everyone who knew were comparing it to the flooding of 1869, as a result of which Korean peasants massively were moving to the Russian territory from that border. Nowadays it's impossible because this border is extremely heavily guarded. So, but back then it wasn't, and back then Russia and Korea didn't have any agreement on the treatment of Koreans, and actually all Koreans back then were becoming Russian citizens and given land. And back in Korea, actually, Korean government didn't like it, and even was asking Russian government to bring those Korean subjects back to prosecute them, but the Russian government didn't. And because also they knew that those people would die, and then of course they needed those people on their own land. So it was so until the end of the 19th century, in 1888, when Russia and Korea finally signed the agreement, and then they were kind of obliged by that agreement to return to all Korean subjects back to Korea. So the immigration kind of slowed down, but still Koreans were immigrating to that very same area. And now, besides peasants, poor peasants, also slowly, by the end of the 19th century, middle class and workers, they also started migrating to Russia, because in Korea the situation actually kept worsening. And then also historically, the role of Japan was increasing at that region, because back then Japan had also had a very aggressive colonization policy. And since 1890s, actually, Japan was also trying to get into those territories, and including in the Manchuria territories and the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, there were a number of wars. First of all, most importantly, there was the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and Russian Empire lost that war to Japan. And it was actually the first time, because back then Russian Empire was considered a Western empire and the Japanese Empire was considered an Eastern empire. It was the first time when, like, the so-called Western Empire lost such an important war to the Eastern Empire. And Japan, after winning that war, took control over the Korean Peninsula. And in 1910, so that war ended in 1905, and in 1910, Korean Peninsula became Japanese colony. So even more Koreans were now moving to that very same Primorsky Krai near Vladivostok, to that tiny piece of land, because now, besides peasants, besides workers and middle class, also all Korean, like, resistance members, they were moving there as well. And I actually will also walk you right now, at this moment, through some historical pictures. So this is Posiet Bay. So basically it's in the same, that's very same area I was talking about, where Koreans were moving. Even that area was later called Posiet Bay, like Korean National District, where all of them lived, was called Posiet. And this is like a photo of the Korean village in Russia, those first villages. You can see Koreans, and there is like a Russian soldier Cossack. They were used as an army actually there, because they were the first one who came to that area, who colonized that uninhabited area. And this is the last Russian Emperor Nicholas II in St. Petersburg. And behind him you can see in white those tiny figures. These are actually Korean troops, because when he was a crown prince in the 1890s, he did his military service in that very same area. And actually he had like Korean soldiers under his command of one of the very first Korean villages that were formed in that area. There were like 3 villages formed in that area. And one of them, it was called Yanchihe village. So those Koreans were from there. So he actually was kind of personally, he knew them, and he met them again later. So this picture, I think, if I remember correctly, was taken in 1912. So he met them in St. Petersburg again, and they were like performing some military exercises in front of their emperor. And the Koreans who moved to Russia, they took a Russian style of life and like Russian clothing. They learned Russian language. So they were trying, from the very beginning, they were trying to assimilate, even though, of course, it was not easy. And especially at the beginning when they came, you saw the previous picture of the Korean village. They looked very different from the other Russian, let's say, so first colonizers of the territory. So they looked very different. So of course there was racism. It was not easy, but still Koreans assimilated quite well. And you can see that in the early 20th century also they were kind of already fully fledged members of the Russian community. And as I mentioned, especially after Korea had become the Japanese colony in the 1910, then a lot of Korean resistance movements members, intelligentsia and military, and also bourgeoisie and like richer aristocrats also, they started moving to Russia. And then of course there were also because of that agreement, it was not so as easy as at the beginning, but still the movement was quite massive. And after 1910 and by 1920s, I think there were already over 100,000 people, definitely, of those Koreans. And now we are coming to very uneasy years. Those years after 1910, when Korea became Japanese colony, after that, the situation got even more tense in that region, and actually there was the civil war. The civil war after the revolution. So there was a revolution in 1917 when Russian Empire became Soviet Union. After that, the Bolshevik, the Communist Revolution, and after the revolution, there was a civil war, which started in after 1917 and 1918, and that civil war was fought in over all territory of the Soviet Union between the Reds, the Communists, and Whites, and in the Far East, that war was fought even stronger, and between 1918 and 1922, Far East actually became independent, let's say so, more or less, from the rest of the Soviet Union, and there was really the standoff between the Bolsheviks on one side, who formed the Far Eastern Republic, and the Japanese troops and US troops. They moved together into Vladivostok as allied troops back then, and they were supporting the Whites because basically they wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks, and the Whites wanted to regain the government, the power in the government, and Japanese basically wanted to colonize the rest of the Far East and move as deep as alongside the two big rivers, Amur and Ussuri, move as far as Lake Baikal. So there was the territorial claim, and the US troops, they were supporting the Japanese and the Whites because basically they were very afraid of the communist victory, and that the Russia would become communist. So they were siding with the Whites. So Japanese and US were Japan and US were siding with the Whites, and Koreans were siding with Bolsheviks, with the Reds, and fighting that war. So that civil war was fought between Whites, Japanese troops and US troops on one side, and mostly Korean troops, so Soviet troops and mostly Korean troops on the other side. So why Korean troops were siding with the Bolshevik for several reasons, basically. As I have already told you, predominantly at the beginning, the Korean immigration into Russia was predominantly from poor peasants. So the majority of those Korean immigrants in the Far East, they were still peasants, so they were relatively poor. And that dream of being equal, so that whole dream that unified peasants and workers, let's say so, in what later became Soviet Union. So people were hoping for equal rights and equal access to land and jobs and things like that. So they were supporting the Reds and the Bolsheviks for that reason. And then the Korean middle class, richer middle class and intelligentsia and bourgeoisie, they were supporting the Bolsheviks because they were hoping that the Bolsheviks would help them to regain and reclaim and fight for the Korean Peninsula back. So they wanted to liberate Korean Peninsula. And they fought very strongly. They actually were very famous back then, in those years, in the Soviet Union. And they were a lot of generals and Korean partisan troops. And they were able, actually, together with the rest of the Bolshevik troops, the communist troops, they actually won that territory back. So the US left in 1920, and the Whites were defeated, and the Whites back then were also based in Siberia, which was quite close geographically. So the Whites were defeated, and the US troops left in 1920, and Japanese troops kept staying there until 1922, but then they have also retreated. Yeah. So we are coming to 1937. So after that, so the Korean troops won, and they got the territory back. So actually, they wanted to establish the independent, autonomous Korean oblast or Korean province. And after 1922, actually in 1924, they kind of were preparing that claim because other autonomous oblasts were being established back then in the 1920s. This was like that time when Stalin hasn't yet centralized power, so the ethnic minorities were given like more favorable policies, and actually there was like this idea or that dream, they didn't last long, that they would be able to form their own like autonomies and be all together under the Soviet rule happily. But that didn't happen, unfortunately, and Koreans, all of them, almost 200,000 people, they were living in the territory, kind of hoping for becoming a Korean autonomous province or autonomous republic under the Soviet rule, but it didn't happen. And when Stalin came to power in the late 1920s, early 1930s, that situation even got worsened dramatically. And actually, even in spite, this is the big irony, and I hope you will also understand it now better after all that history, why all that history was so important, that because even though Koreans worked so hard, they developed those lands, they actually started cultivating rice. This is the first time when Korean peasants started cultivating rice on that lands. And when that land, that Far Eastern Republic, was also held under the allied troops of Japanese and US troops, the Japanese also were trying to massively cultivate rice in that area, because they needed food for their colony, like for the Korean colony and for the rest of the territory. So that rice started being grown and cultivated massively by the Koreans in those years. So they developed that land tremendously. They fought the war. They actually gained their territory back for the Soviet Union, but still they were the suspicious minority in the Stalin's eyes. And that also partially was racial, partially since Korea kept being a Japanese colony, and those Koreans were still, in the eyes of Japan, Japanese subjects. Also, Stalin kind of thought that they would, he didn't trust them because of that and because of many other reasons. And then also Manchuria, part of Manchuria, in 1931 became a Japanese colony, and the state of Manchukuo was formed in 1932. So Japanese territory was right there now, in if we can say so, in Stalin's face on that territory. And right there was this tiny piece of land where those 200,000 Koreans lived, and so he was quite kind of very afraid that those people, that minority, they would side with Japan, and actually Japan would keep seizing the territory and taking it from the Soviet Union. So this is one of the reasons that he took that decision in 1937 to deport the entire ethnic group. All of those Koreans, and those Koreans, 200,000 people, Soviet Koreans, there were no more Soviet Koreans left. All of them lived there. Also, because of the Soviet policies, they were eventually put all together, and that Posyet national kind of Korean district was formed, where all of them lived, and almost 200,000 people by 1937. And so Stalin takes this decision. Also, kind of the situation was really going bad, and we know that afterwards, after those Koreans had been deported, also there was this war, this undeclared war fought between Russia and Japan. There were two very important battles: battle on the Lake Hassan in 1938, and Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, fought between Russia and Japan because of the territory. Already after Stalin had deported Koreans in 1937, so he takes this decision in August 1937 to deport the entire ethnicity. As we have just spoken about it, there was this important political reason behind it. And also there was this economic reason, because why has Stalin deported them to Central Asia? Because as they grew rice very successfully, and those Central Asian lands were completely underdeveloped. So actually, there is a theory that there was also economic reason behind that deportation, that they would start growing rice massively in Central Asia. which they eventually did. So, and the political reason was also kind of obvious, especially that the war still started even without the Koreans in that territory. And also, as you saw the map earlier, it was not the first movement. Even before that, in 1935, 1936, actually Stalin and his government, they were massively moving Germans and Poles from the western borders with Poland also, since the kind of the threat was coming from both sides, from the Western Europe, Eastern European border, and from the far eastern border in the east. So from the Eastern European border, this was Nazi Hitler's Germany, and from the eastern border, this was Japan. So, and especially after Germany and Japan has already agreed, like they made a pact. So these are the reasons why those Koreans were deported. And people say, but how come he just decided based on that to take and deport the entire group of 200,000 people? So he it was quite valid in a bad way decision, because they already had an experience of moving people when they were moving Germans and Poles. These were 65,000 people at least in 1935-36, and so just putting 200,000 people on the trains and shipping them to Central Asia was not really just something he couldn't do, basically.
Can you take us aboard the trains now? Can you just...
Yeah. So actually I have videos, so maybe we can listen to... There was a long historical speech, so I hope it was useful. And so we can listen now to the survivor of the deportation. So how was the deportation?
Ну, разговоры такие были. К тому времени готовилась война с Японией. И вот по обличию корейцы и японцы похожи. Чтобы не мешались они тут, вроде вывезли, да? А так на самом деле я не знаю, вот почему вывезли нас оттуда. И причем давали, по-моему, всего сутки на сборы. И в теплушку, и тут сюда. И долго же ехали. Теплушка, знаешь, что такое? Это товарный вагон. Вот полочки сделали, чтобы нары, вернее, сделали люди внизу и на нарах. Это товарные вагоны, теплушками называли. Значит, чтобы люди не мерзли, в вагоне в середине буржуйки вот такие ставили. Это железные эти печки такие. И трубу выводили. Вот так. Говорят, больше месяца везли. Ну, сколько я точно не скажу. Ну, разговоры такие были, больше месяца везли. Везли. Тут тоже, наверное, не обошлось без потерь. Как обычно бывает у нас. И ведь даже тех, кто были на партийных работах, там же и партийные организации же были, партийные работники, все вот так куча, все вместе.
I'll show you one more video, and I hope we still have more time to talk about it. It's let's listen first to the video. It's and I'll tell you later about this person.
С вечером за ними пришли работники НКВД и дали полчаса на сбор, сказали взять с собой документы и продукты питания, предметы первой необходимости. Потом всех построили и посадили на товарный вагон и отправили в Узбекистан. По их рассказам, они где-то ехали в Узбекистан, но там условия были очень тяжелые, потому что у многих еда кончилась, пить воду давали не всегда, особенно много умирало в пути. Это маленькие дети и старики, пожилые и старые женщины. Ну, моей мамы, родители сами почти ничего не кушали и не пили, они отдавали детям. И поэтому от истощения они умерли по пути. И времени не было хоронить их, и только это. Охранники уже мертвых, их оставляли в сугробах возле железнодорожной насыпи.
Can I ask, are there any estimates for how many died en route?
Yes, there are estimates. So these were. Sorry, 1 second. I'll just take this away from the screen. And oh, sorry. Yeah, there are estimates of how many people died on that route, indeed, and these were approximately 40,000 people. So they deported 172,000 people, and about 100 people were sent to Kazakhstan, or 95,000. Sorry, 95,000 people were sent to Kazakhstan, and about 77,000 people were sent to Uzbekistan. And that train journey lasted between 1 month and 2 months. In the dire conditions, those trains were crossing Siberia, and Koreans were loaded on the cattle trains, on the cargo trains, and 40,000 people died basically during that trip and during the first year when they came to Kazakhstan and to Uzbekistan, because those conditions for them over there were very bad, and they come to basically lands that were uninhabited, and they were not fit for agricultural purposes, and that besides that political reason, the economic reason of bringing Koreans to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan was developing those lands agriculturally. So that person you saw who was talking about that train journey, the last video, he was talking about his grandparents and about his parents, because his name is Nikolai Tan, and he's actually, in my multimedia long read, he's one of the major characters through through his family. I was actually being able to show that story, like to portray that bigger picture through individual stories, let's say so. So his parents from both sides and his grandparents from both sides, they came to Uzbekistan on those trains. And he's talking about his maternal grandparents who died during the trip. And his maternal grandparents were traveling on the train together with their 3 daughters. And his mother, Nikolai's mother, Galina, and Galina Lee, and her 2 sisters. So they were able to get enough food to feed their 3 daughters, and 3 daughters survived, but grandparents died, both of them out of starvation, and their bodies were thrown away into the snow. Nobody knows where and how. And I was telling you about the civil war. That the grandfather of Nikolai, he was actually very prominent fighting that civil war, and he was a hero of that civil war, and he fought that war together with Sergei Lazov, who was also a very famous military leader in that war in the Far East, and that's how actually he ended up in the snow somewhere on the road, and no one knows there, no one knows where. And they came to Uzbekistan. They were brought to Uzbekistan in 1937 to the Tashkent province, basically surrounding Tashkent, the capital city, where there was Chirchik River, and potentially lands would be suitable for growing rice, as that there is this economic theory that Koreans were brought to Central Asia to grow rice. But back then, there was nothing on those lands. If you go nowadays to Uzbekistan, to Tashkent, and you see the city, it's an amazing city, full of life, and post-Soviet Central Asian capital with bazaars and like incredible mix of people and incredible fruit orchards and cotton fields and other fields and rice fields surrounding Tashkent. So when Koreans were brought there in 1937, there was nothing there, only swamps. And they were basically put to work on those swamps. They were brought and put into special communities in Uzbekistan. In the Tashkent province, they were guarded 24/7, like under armed guard by NKVD. They lived in special barracks, and they were made to work and dry out those swamps. And actually, Nikolai's parents, Galina Lee and Konstantin Ten, they met on those swamps, working together. And they fell in love, and they got married eventually. So it was like, even in spite of those hardships, it was like a kind of happy story for them. But this is, I have a video of him actually talking about his parents.
Отец Тен Константин Васильевич родился 12 октября 1917 года в городе Комсомольске на Амуре, Приморского края. Вместе с родителями, с отцом, матерью и 3 сыновьями в 1937 году были репрессированы и сосланы в Узбекистан, в Верничечийский район, Таш область. Моя мама, это Галина Васильевна, родилась 25 декабря 1919 года в селе Крабы Приморского края. Она также была репрессирована в 1937 году и сослана в Узбекистан. Они приехали в Узбекистан, это где-то в Верничечийском районе. Им сказали обустраиваться, здесь были болота, непроходимые камыши. И очень много было не тигров, а шакалов. И волки даже здесь обитали, боялись, потому что они прям подходили к их домам. Вначале они жили специально в бараках и под охраной, чтобы никто не мог куда-то уйти. Их охраняли охранники специально вооруженные. Это солдат. Они познакомились только в Узбекистане. Их в одно место всех привезли, и мои родители, как и все репрессивные корейцы, осушали болото, вырубали камыши. Это был очень тяжелый труд. Они жили в шалашах. Очень много было комаров. Люди болели малярией, и многие умирали, потому что не было лекарств. Но благодаря их героическому труду болота были осушены, камыши вырублены. И потом их попросили сажать рис на этих землях, чтобы прокормить себя и чтобы сдавать государству рис.
Victor, can I just interrupt there? We're talking 1937, so I mean the terror has started, and that was the year that a famous Uzbek leader, Fayzullah Khajayev, was arrested. He was executed the next year. His family sent to Siberia, and he's just Nikolai's just described some of the physical terrors and challenges they face, but the political challenges. I wonder, were the Korean community, did they suffer that as much as anybody else? The purges and the repression, or were they given a little bit more space to cultivate the rice, as you suggest?
Well, they had actually already suffered the purges back in the Far East, back in the Primorsky Krai, because this was particularly part because it coincided precisely with the Great Terror in 1937. It also, I think, started even the same year. So all kind of strategic party members and those Koreans in the military and some others, at least 2,000 by the records, but many said there were like more than, there were tens of thousands of Koreans. They were purged, and instead of being sent to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they were sent to Siberian gulags. And I don't know if we'll have time to cover it in full, also looking at the time right now, but this is also part of my multimedia long read, and this is, so Nikolai's 10 grandparents and parents in Tashkent, they were deported to Tashkent, to Central Asia, but his uncle, his maternal uncle, his mother's brother, so his mother's name was Galina Lee, so Further Lee, he was his mother's brother, he was in the military at the same time. He was a young soldier, not in the same village of Krabs, but in the village of Kraskino, where also they had like a military unit position there. So when they took the decision, when Stalin took that decision to deport Koreans to Uzbekistan in 1937, and his whole family was being put on the trains, he was being sent directly to the Siberian Gulag in the Komi Autonomous Soviet Republic. And he was part of that purge, basically. And his story is told in my multimedia long read. And in Uzbekistan, the political persecutions were for all Koreans because, as I mentioned, they were guarded 24/7. They lived in special barracks. They could not move. They had restrictions on their movement. Their passports were taken when they were being deported, and then the special documents were given to them where the restrictions were put on their movements. So they couldn't move anywhere. And this is this is the main reason why those Korean collective farms, so they dried those lands in less than 5 years, in actually almost 3 years. They dried all of those lands in the Tashkent province surrounding Tashkent, and those Korean collective farms were formed on those same lands. So as soon as those lands were made suitable for agriculture, here it's all in Russian, but basically that area in the center is the Tashkent province, and those areas along the Chirchik River, you can see that river in blue, basically. These are the names of the places where Korean collective farms were being established, and Koreans had to grow rice, cotton, and jute on those lands. Basically, that's the reason why those densely populated Korean collective farms were established there, because Koreans had to live there, like they had nowhere to go, basically, and they had to work on the fields. And their only way of survival, and they had learned this way of survival in a very hard way through that whole history I've been sharing with you in the Russian Far East. That's the same way of survival they were applying now in the Tashkent province in Uzbekistan to do everything better than the others, and to live better and to work better, work harder. So they were working hard. That titanic labor, that gigantic labor, basically, this is what saved their lives, and basically slowly helped them to regain their status of eventually of fully fledged Soviet citizens, thanks to that labor, because those Korean kolkhozes, collective farm in Russian. So those Korean kolkhozes over the years of the Second World War, because right after that the Second World War started, and in 1939, and for the Soviet Union it was the Great Patriotic War, which started in 1941. So throughout the years of that war, those Koreans worked on those collective farms, and they actually grew rice, cotton, and jute. And actually, thanks to jute, because they used jute, that very strong fabric, to make robes and all kinds of materials like they needed for the war. The Koreans actually survived, and I have a video.
But before you show the video, can I perhaps unfairly give you 5 minutes to bring it up to the present day, just to give a chance for questions? You've talked about the survival there. Can you maybe just in 5 minutes or so talk about how ultimately they did prosper, and what's the situation today?
I actually have that video. That's how they prospered, yeah? And then we'll move to the present day. So this is how they prospered through those Korean kolkhozes where they worked. And this guy, he was the director of one of those kolkhozes. So he's talking out of his personal experience. He was the director of one of those strategic millionaire kolkhozes for many, many years.
Было вот по Ташкентской области, вот это Верхнечистинский район, да, в Верхнечистинском районе были 6 колхозов было. 6 колхозов, ну, из них 5 почти корейские были. И все 6 колхозах работали 6 председателей корейцы. Вот так вот. Вот Среднечистинский район, там было тоже очень много. Тоже колхозов 5 было. Корейские колхозы, да, где корейцы в большей части проживали. Корейцы — это трудолюбивый народ очень, да. Вот. Земледелием они занимались очень хорошо, вот, обеспечивали всегда, вот, развивались. Вот поэтому они такие были. Ну, хорошо, если работаешь, чтобы получали больше урожая. Урожая больше сдаешь, больше деньги поступают. Вот за счет этого они и колхозникам раздавали деньги, и, значит, оставалось деньги для развития. Вот, вот так вот они развивались. Рис. Вот, рис. Потом, значит, стали выращивать хлопок. Вот. Потом, значит, стали выращивать кинав. Кинав в основном стали выращивать Верхний Чечистский район и Нижний Чечистский район. Нижний Чечистский район кинав. Это в основном были кинафосеющие районы. Вот за счет кинафу вот, стало столько много героев сотруда, получали большие урожаи. Вот. Ну, это было 48 до 52 года.
And just to give you a glimpse also of the reality of life back then, that person who survived the deportation, he had to work as a small boy on those collective farms.
Корейцы в основном рисом занимались. Ну, что и сахарной свеклой занимались, и нас, маленьких, посылали убирать эту свеклу. А вот на пшеничных полях жучков ловили. Иначе они портили весь посев. Вот так. Потом, когда мы подросли в школе немного, на хлопок стали посылать. Иногда директор сам нас мобилизует и давай. Ну, жилья-то там нету, собирать хлопок, это осенью тепло еще. Кто как устраивался там, собирали тоже.
So we can continue. I have many more things to tell and the stories to tell.
I think let's move to some questions.
Yes.
And please contact Victoria. You can find many more of her videos online, and they're well worth a watch. But I'm sure people have questions, whether it's about the situation today for Koreans in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia, or picking up on some of the story that you've just heard. So please, over to you.
I have also more videos about the conditions, so any question you have, I hope I will be able to answer and show maybe more things I've got.
That was really good, thanks. Has there any Korean language survived in the communities? And what's the relationship between the Koreas and the Koreans in Central Asia now? Do they offer any kind of link still?
Yes, actually it's a very good question. Thank you very much for this question. The language survived mostly among the older generations of the original deportees, and my grandfather was one of them. And indeed, that was the dialect of northern Hamgyong. So back then it was one unified Hamgyong province in the still unified Korea. In the modern day North Korea, it's North Hamgyong province. So most of Koreans, over 90%, or at least 90% of all Soviet Koreans, they are originally from that province. Because as we all saw, this is how they immigrated to Korea from the northern tip of Hamgyong province on the Korean peninsula. And basically the language they brought is the North Hamgyong dialect. The food they brought to Soviet Union and later to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, is the cuisine of North Hamgyong province, accustomed to the local ingredients in the Far East and in Central Asia and Uzbekistan. But unfortunately that language, it's called Koryomar, it's the language of Soviet Koreans. It's almost lost nowadays because only the elder generation spoke it. And then because of the restrictions that they existed for ethnic minorities, even those minorities which were majorities in their own countries of the Soviet Union, like Uzbeks for instance, also even the predominant majority of Soviet Uzbekistan, they could not freely exercise their language and their culture during the Soviet years. So Koreans, the minority which used to be even more restricted and had a much more sensitive stance in that region and in the Soviet Union in general, they over the years they kind of lost their language, and their children and their grandchildren who became fully fledged citizens after Stalin's death, and maybe if we have a chance to talk about it a little bit more detail later on, how they managed to become fully fledged citizens and how those restrictions were removed. Their parents and grandparents, they didn't teach them to speak Korean. So that language, it's almost extinct. But still, when it's spoken in those Korean kolkhozes, it's the Koreomar, the language of Northern Hamgyong.
What about the relationship between the Koreas and the Korean community in Central Asia?
So it's a very fascinating question, actually. So that story of the forced deportation to Central Asia, and that whole existence of Koreans in Central Asia and the reasons for that existence, until the late 1980s, this was a prohibited subject. That's why we kind of didn't study it at school, or even nowadays, and even early, even worse. So those topics, they couldn't be discussed, and of course, there was no way to have any form of cultural cooperation with any of the Koreas before then, because of those restrictions on those Koreans and their very complicated history, because I guess Soviet Union was afraid of possible repercussions also for the treatment, or mistreatment, I should rather say, of those Soviet Koreans. But in the 1980s, when Michael Gorbachev came to power and he first introduced freedom of speech, with the freedom of speech also, all those topics, they slowly opened up for discussion. And for Koreans, it was actually a miraculous thing, because they were able to proclaim their Koreanness, or for the first time, they were openly able to kind of state their Koreanness. And this is when the first relationship was formed between those Soviet Koreans and North Korea, surprisingly. Well, not surprisingly back then, because North Korea was a communist state and it had good relations with the Soviet Union for most of the time. So in the late 1980s, North Korean teachers of Korean language and North Korean experts, and even like actors and dancers and kind of pop troops, popular troops, like musicians, they started coming to those Korean kolkhozes, and this is when Koreans started enjoying their Koreanness without thinking about whether it was North Korea or not. It was just the common Koreanness which unifies all Koreans everywhere. They were enjoying music, traditional folk songs, and clothes and beautiful hanboks. So this is when Koreans were able to proclaim their Koreanness for the first time and enjoy all the good parts of their culture it brought to them. But they didn't last long, because the Soviet Union broke up in the 1990s, and the relationship with North Korea, they kind of stopped, because there was no Soviet Union anymore, so they were not supporting North Korea. So North Korean presence stayed until the very recent past, actually, in Uzbekistan and Central Asia. North Korean embassy was closed down this year in Uzbekistan for some reason. Kim Jong-un took the decision to close down North Korean embassy. But there were these like tiny remainders of that few years in the late 1980s, of that decade or even less, of interaction. And in the independent Uzbekistan, after the Soviet Union had broken down, of course, South Korea took the role of, the bigger Korea that would support that community of Soviet Koreans. And they have been supporting, South Korea have been supporting Koreans throughout all of the throughout all of the former Soviet Union, in Russia, and especially in Uzbekistan, where a lot of Koreans, in Kazakhstan, in all the stands where the Koreans are, and they help Koreans. We have very good relationship in general with South Korea, our countries, and in terms of Koreans, Soviet Koreans, they help. We have language schools, we have like cultural exchange going on. People try to go to South Korea. Sometimes they were opening and closing visa lines for people to go to work or to study. Also, young Koreans, they try actually to go to South Korea also to study and to work. So yes, there is a relationship now, but mostly with South Korea.
Another question.
If most of the ethnic Koreans were sequestered on the collective farms, how did your grandparents meet, and how did other Koreans end up integrating into Russian society and taking Russian spouses?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. And they were integrating into the Russian society and the Uzbek society in Uzbekistan, like in all the societies in the rest of the stans. So why the Koreans were able to travel and move and marry, even with other citizens. So Koreans, that difficult time for Soviet Koreans, for Central Asian Koreans, lasted until 1953. 1953 is the year when Joseph Stalin dies, and since 1954, the restrictions they had, they were slowly taken away from them. I mean, the restrictions, they were withdrawn. So in 1954, they gave them freedom of movement, relative freedom of movement within Uzbekistan and later within the Soviet Union. In 1956, when they had the 20th Party Congress, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, he officially denounced the Stalin's cult of personality, and with that cult of personality, one good thing for the Koreans was that also all those policies of restrictions on all those unwanted, so-called unwanted ethnic minorities, they also stopped. So basically, since 1956, Koreans were given the status of fully-fledged citizens, and maybe it did not immediately improve the lives of the first generation of the deportees, but the lives of their children and grandchildren. So they became fully-fledged Soviet citizens. They could go to schools, they could go to universities all over Soviet Union. My grandfather, he came as a very small child, so he was 7 years old in 1937. So he, after those restrictions were lifted, he was able to study. He studied in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent, and became an engineer. He went to study in Moscow, and also there were very few Koreans back then. He was probably among the first ones who went to study in Moscow. And he and my grandmother, even though my grandmother tells like a legend that she supposedly saw my grandfather in Moscow in the dorm because he was like one of the only Koreans there, and she had seen him. But they didn't meet back then. They met in Ukraine because both of them, they were actually sent to Soviet Ukraine to work. This was the policy also. After you graduated from school, the state would send you where it was most needed. And this is where they met. But my grandmother claims she had seen him in the dorm, actually, where they studied in Moscow. So for the children and grandchildren of the original deportees, their life conditions really improved, and they were able to have like a normal life of Soviet citizens.
Another question.
So I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but if you've ever been to South or North Korea, how much of the Korean culture that you have experienced in Uzbekistan is still the same to the Korean culture that you might have encountered in Korea, / how much has the Korean culture assimilated and, I guess, changed since the Koreans came to Uzbekistan?
Okay, I've been to South Korea a number of times. I haven't been personally to North Korea, but I have very good friends who go there regularly, actually, and the column knows them as well. The Korea Tours, who manage regular trips to Pyongyang, and many of you probably know, so Nick Bonner and Simon Cockerell. So I kind of haven't been personally to North Korea, but I closely follow a lot of issues because I'm also actually a Korean studies specialist myself. So about the assimilation of culture, well, from what I can say is that Soviet Koreans, they kept maybe the fundamental traditions of all Koreans, and the language, which was the language of Northern Koreans, and they observe the festivities, like traditional festivities, like Chuseok and Hansik and other Solal. They also organize weddings, like Korean-style weddings, and of course, probably, I guess these are traditions which are similar, which probably would be, which have more similarity with North Korean traditions, I guess, rather than with South Korean traditions. But younger generations now, I think they mostly follow also South Korean, of course, pop music and like K-pop and all those things, and there is much more exchange of people going on between Uzbekistani Koreans and post-Soviet Koreans and Southern Koreans. So yeah, there are similarities. After all of these people are Koreans, and of course also it's quite a complicated issue, I think, for all Koreans, because I've also lived a lot of years in the US. I also had a lot of experience with American Koreans, especially in Washington D.C., in Annandale, the Korean community, and my school in Washington D.C. So they're like cousins, even within Korean society. They're like closer cousins and more distant cousins. So I guess actually even one Southern Korean friend of mine told so himself that Soviet Koreans are like more distant cousins of Southern Koreans. So of course they have the unifying Korean cultural and social and like anthropologic things, but they're also different. They are very specifically this is like Soviet Korean and post-Soviet Korean culture. Even the cuisine, it's called actually Soviet Korean cuisine. So this is the unique community of Koreans probably, and it has its own uniqueness and its own differences as well.
Victoria, this might be the moment for a closing video, maybe the Hamsik video. But before you do that, I want to ask a question. Not a few years ago, not I think it was probably four years ago, maybe maximum. In Tashkent, one of the newest museums there is a museum to the victims of repression. Given the way contemporary Uzbekistan is, it stops with the birth of an independent Uzbekistan, doesn't address any of the serious concerns many countries have about the situation today, but it ends in 1991. And I visited that museum, and it's fascinating for how it looks at the history to then. But I didn't pay enough attention, and I will do next time, I promise, to, do you know, does it mention the deportation, and how has Uzbekistan now addressed that whole issue? How are you acknowledged as victims?
I have to admit I haven't been to that museum myself, but this is the place I'm planning to go on my next visit to Tashkent. That's true. I'm not inventing it right now, but I know that there is a section on the Korean deportations to Uzbekistan in that museums, and yes, Koreans are officially recognized as the victims of that deportation by our government, and this is a very complicated topic for the diaspora itself and for all Koreans, because for so many years, next year we will celebrate the 80th anniversary of that deportation and that arrival of Koreans to Uzbekistan. So for over 50 years, for almost 60 years, people were not even allowed to mention it. And then slowly things changed. Since 1991, they was like supposedly free to talk about it, but as you can imagine, most of people didn't, and people are still afraid to talk about it. So our diasporas are it's very sensitive issues, and our diasporas, they're not like, shouting about it from every corner, but our government does recognize that deportation is one of the crimes of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet state and Stalin, and actually there were a number of occasions where our late president talked about it, and he talked about it in the anniversaries, because we do celebrate the anniversaries of arrival of Koreans. So he was talking about it during the 70s and 75th anniversary, and once in 2005, during the I don't remember who. Sorry, I just don't remember the name of the Korean president back then in 2005. But the Korean president, the president of South Korea, on a state visit when came to Uzbekistan, actually, our late president personally said to the president of South Korea back then that the only good thing Stalin did is bringing Koreans to Uzbekistan, because they raised, they really developed our agriculture to incredible heights for the Soviet Union and even for our independent country.
Would you like to show us the Hamsik video?
Yes. I'll show the Hamsik video.
Да, корейцев много здесь похоронено, полное кладбище там. Ну, времени сколько прошло? 37-го года, слушай. Это сколько лет прошло? Даже в 37 году родился человек. А еще, если там в России родился, знаете, еще прибавить, да? И вот так вот. Вот завтра как раз родительский день, 5 апреля, на кладбище везде будут корейцы. Вот завтра обязательно поминание. Этот день такой, и могилу чистят, и приводят в порядок там. И потом, значит, еду обрядных ставят там, посидишь там. Порядок такой. Если вот люди поминают, да, расстелят там, еду привезли там и так далее. Если кто-то посторонний придет, то даже радуются люди, давай, садись с нами вместе.
So that what you saw was the equivalent of Tomb Sweeping Day in China. So it's 5th of April, it's Hanshik, yeah, the day when all Koreans and Chinese and Japanese, I believe as well, they celebrate the memory of their deceased ancestors.
Victoria, thank you very much indeed for sharing your story and all your knowledge. Just before we give you a well-deserved round of applause, what's your next step? Are you working on a full-length documentary, or what are your plans?
Yeah, I am working indeed on a fully fledged documentary. I will just very quickly show you something. It's another feature, because this is one multimedia project, and it talks about the deportation of Koreans to Uzbekistan. It also talks about second and third waves of repression, what I call them. So the second one, I already talked about it briefly. It's about those Koreans who were sent to Siberian gulags in 1937. And the third wave is when Uzbekistani Koreans went back to reclaim their historical motherland in North Korea, actually. And it happened during the years of the Korean War in 1950s. And they helped Kim Il-sung to establish the DPRK, and actually they became his first government and first apparatus. They were about, so there were several hundreds of them, and there were at least 200, so there were at least between 200 and 400 Uzbek Koreans who went there. So the next step after that long read became this feature, the Soviet Korean who ended the forgotten war. You can also find it on the Diplomat online, on the Diplomat's website. And he was probably the most prominent one of them. He was the one who signed the Korean armistice on behalf of Kim Il-sung in 1953 that technically stopped the Korean War, that General Nam-il. He was from Uzbekistan. He was one of those Uzbekistani Koreans. So this is the third wave of repressions, what I call. I'm working right now on the feature about the second wave of repressions, about those Koreans who ended up in the Siberian gulags, because I'm trying to gather more memories and more stories about them, because there are practically none, and I hope I will be able to do so. And we're also working on a documentary based on my stories with a Korean American director. His name is Christopher H.K. Lee, and he already shot a number of documentaries on the complicated issues of the Korean history. He has his own project which is called Fading Away. You can also Google him and this project. And his documentaries, they talk also about the Korean Wars. He has a documentary which talks about a North Korean defect in the US, Grace. I think the name of the movie is I'm Grace. Another movie is about the Korean War veteran. I think he escaped also somehow, and so it's like his journey as a child during the Korean War. So he's quite well known in his area, and we're working together to make the next movie on Uzbekistani Koreans, basically, and the journey. Basically, we want also to trace that journey from the Far East to Uzbekistan. We finished pre-production stage, and we are now raising funds to start actual production. So wish us luck, so we can bring it to the big screens.
Great. It's pretty obvious. You need to watch this space. You know, even we've been able to scrape the surface, but many more fascinating stories that you'll continue to explore. So please join me in a round of applause for Victoria Kim.
Thank you very much.
Well, this is an extraordinary evening. I'm sure that nobody in the room knew anything about this before they came here. And it really is an astonishing story, and we're so lucky to have someone who's involved in it, to be able to tell the story so vividly. Thank you very much indeed. May I, on behalf of Royal Asiatic Society, give you a present of our journal. Callum, one of our monographs about Chinese families who settled in England. Before we go, just quickly make a puff for the Royal Asiatic Society. We've been going in the world for nearly 200 years, and in Beijing for 3 years, and we organize roughly 2 events every month discussing something that is trying to bring typically China and the world together. I'm not sure how Victoria's talk fits into that. I've been trying to squeeze it in, but it was such a fascinating topic that we couldn't resist over it. So if you'd like to find out more about the Royal Asiatic Society, if you're attending, you can look at our QR code. Otherwise, you can just remember rasbj.org, have a look at our website, and add your name to our mailing list. We'll be having events during the rest of this year, and more for next year, of course. And so please thank you very much indeed for coming to this event. And let's thank again Victoria for a wonderful event.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
And thank the Bookworm very much for having laid it all on. Thank you, Yulia.
Thank you, all of you.
You can also keep reading the story, because actually two other parts I haven't told. So Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story. You can find it online and read and watch the videos, the photos, etc. Thank you.
Salsa.
Very exciting.